And tonight, both the US Senate and the US House of Representatives have voted in favour of the US Justice Department releasing all the files it holds on the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. It means that the bill will now go to the president for signing. Survivors of Epstein were speaking outside Congress earlier. There was also the MAGA loyalist, or former loyalist to President Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who spoke of the rift that had developed between the Republican base and the president over the issue.
I wasn't a Johnny-come-lately to the MAGA train. I was day one 2015, and there's a big difference in those Americans and those that decided to support President Trump later on. And I'll tell you right now, this has been one of the most destructive things to MAGA. Watching this actually turn into a fight has ripped MAGA apart. And the only thing that will speak to the powerful, courageous women behind me is when action is actually taken to release these files, and the American people won't tolerate any other bull. That's where we are today.
Well, President Trump was asked about the release of the Epstein files during that meeting with the Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman. That's what he said. This is what he said.
Why wait for Congress to release the Epstein files? Why not just do it now?
You know, it's not the question that I mind, it's your attitude. I think you are a terrible reporter. It's the way you ask these questions. You start off with a man who's highly respected, asking him a horrible, insubordinate, and just a terrible question. And you could even ask that same exact question nicely. You're all psyched up. Somebody psychs you over at ABC. They're going to psych it. You're a terrible person and a terrible reporter.
Well, let's talk to somebody who's certainly not a terrible reporter, Julia Manchester, White House reporter for The Hill. Good evening to you, Julia.
Good evening, Carol. And Mary Bruce, who he was talking to, isn't a terrible reporter either. She's great.
Well, I'm sure, Julia, an excellent reporter will describe you as. Let's talk about the votes on the Epstein files. Where have we got to?
So it is passed through the House and the Senate, and a senior White House official just told me that that bill will be signed by the president whenever it gets to the White House. Now, it's a very busy evening at the White House here in Washington. We know that President Trump is hosting Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He is coming back to the White House after a bilateral meeting earlier today for a black tie dinner that is hosted by President Trump. So we don't exactly know when it will be signed exactly, with this dinner happening, and the dinner, starting to likely to kick off probably within the next hour or so. But major news, and really a major reversal from where we were before. President Trump just last week seemingly was against releasing the Epstein files. However, on Sunday night, he called on House Republicans to vote to release them, and Republicans fell in line.
And what do you think prompted that pretty major U-turn, despite his very defensive response to that question? He has now said, hasn't he, that he will sign the bill, that he will order the release of all these files.
President Trump seemingly, I think, understood that there were going to be a lot of Republicans, maybe not necessarily a majority, but a significant amount of Republicans in the House who were going to vote for the bill's release, or for the bill to be passed through the House, for the files to be released. We know that President Trump and many of his allies in Congress and the vice president throughout the 2024 campaign trail or election were campaigning in part on releasing the Epstein files. This is something the hardcore conservative MAGA base has called for. And it's an issue, it's a story that President Trump really hasn't been able to outrun. I mean, I think a perfect example of this is when the president went to the UK earlier this year or this summer, and he stepped off the plane, and the first question he was asked about was the Epstein files. So I think President Trump and Republicans want to move on from this as soon as possible.
And we should say, of course, that President Trump has denied that he ever knew anything about any wrongdoing. We've already had some 20,000 files released last week. They did talk about him spending some time with one of Epstein's victims. The Republicans said that that was Virginia Giuffre, whose posthumous memoirs have been published. She said that she never had a problem with President Trump. Do you think it's reached the stage that he thinks that he won't be damaged by the release of all these documents?
I mean, it's unclear. You would think that if he is calling on Republicans to vote for the release of this and also signaling to Republicans to start focusing on issues like promoting the Big Beautiful Bill Act, for example, and focusing on issues like affordability, you would think that the president does not have anything to hide. But overall, I think the White House views this as a very unflattering distraction and just a very negative news story. I mean, Carol, your listeners in the UK are very well aware. This is a story that brought down, former Prince Andrew, who's now Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. It brought down the former UK ambassador to the United States, Peter Mendelsohn. We know that Larry Summers, a former White House economic advisor, a Democrat, has stepped back from public duties because of ties to Jeffrey Epstein. So this is a really tough story that no one wants to touch because it's just so incredibly toxic, and the White House realizes that.
Julia Manchester, White House reporter for The Hill. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much. Well, I'm joined now by Mick Mulroy, former US Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Good evening to you, Mick.
Good evening to you as well, Carol. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. First of all, that relationship between the US and the Saudis, some uncomfortable questions there. But, I mean, underlying this, the two countries are quite important allies, aren't they?
Absolutely. They're all valid questions, of course, but the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia goes beyond any particular leader at any given time. It is very important, not only to stabilizing the region, but world economies, advancement in technology, the path ahead, for example, in Gaza. Saudi is likely to be one of the main components in the reconstruction. So there's many things that the United States and Saudi work together economically, diplomatically, and security-wise. So that is important to point out. This is a very young crown prince. It's important. That's also important to point out. He's around 40, so he could be in charge of Saudi Arabia for many, many decades to come.
And as we heard there were those questions about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi back in 2018. I mean, he was killed at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and we've had that subsequent US intelligence report that concluded that Mohammed bin Salman had approved the operation that led to his death. I mean, how do you think it is that MBS, as he's known, has simply managed to somehow draw a line under that, sidestep all the questions about it?
Well, I don't think he's sidestepped all the questions about it. I mean, he's in the Oval Office, and you saw, and obviously you played the reporter from ABC News, and it's important to point out, I too am an ABC News national security and defense analyst that posed the question. There's an old adage: you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. And the intelligence community, led by the CIA, was pretty definitive that not only did MBS know of this plot, but he essentially ordered it. And I think that, at the end of the day, is the facts that we should take as true.
And I mean, I believe you were at the State Department at the time of this murder, but it did really shock the world, didn't it, that a journalist should actually be murdered inside a Saudi consulate?
Yes, absolutely. A Saudi consulate, a Washington Post, obviously an American media outlet, journalist was killed in such a horrible fashion. And then, according to the reports, dismembered, and the body was never found. So an absolutely horrible situation. It there's no way to justify it or to make any excuse for it. But that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a continuing relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and it's not incredibly important, just as it is between Saudi and many other countries. That's going to endure, and it's important to the security of the region.
Were you surprised at the way that President Trump reacted to those questions, supported his guest, and was clearly very unhappy at the line of questioning?
I don't usually get into domestic politics. I could say that I think President Trump's many of his initiatives, to include the 20-point plan in Gaza, stabilizing and developing Syria in a way that's not only helpful for the region, but also economically prosperous and could even hold the key to get Europe off of Russian oil and gas. There's many other parts to this that Saudi Arabia is very important as a contributor. And I think he views it that way. Why he felt the need to defend, I think, the defensible when it comes to the murder of Khashoggi, I don't know, but certainly the relationship and the importance to all these key initiatives. And of course, the Abraham Accords, which it looks like Saudi Arabia gave at least tentative agreement that it would join as long as there is a path to a Palestinian state, also a huge initiative, also very important of the president.
And we did see that very important vote at the United Nations last night, approving the next stage of the US peace plan, including the establishment of this stabilization force. I mean, what role does Saudi Arabia, do you think, play in trying to keep this process, this plan for Gaza on course?
So, Carol, the next step is the insertion of this international stabilization force. It's likely that we wouldn't have seen any donor nations if they didn't have this UN mandate behind it. So that was a big step and a successful one in this process. Now they'll likely have a donor conference where countries will come together. There'll be some that will contribute forces. There'll be some that contribute funding. I think Saudi Arabia will play an important part of that, likely from everything I'm hearing on the funding side. And then when we get into the phase 3, the reconstruction of Gaza could cost $100 billion plus and take 10 years. Saudi Arabia, along with UAE and other Gulf countries, are likely going to play the lion's share of that reconstruction cost. So Saudi Arabia is very important when it comes to that effort. If they refuse to participate or they don't agree with the plan and step away, it could cause it to collapse. So it's very important that they, and not just them, other countries as well, agree to participate so we can get to a place where ultimately there's two states living side by side peacefully.
Yeah, I mean, as we were saying, the US sees the Saudis as key allies in the Middle East region. They're going to sell these significant numbers of F-35 fighter jets. Is that just about cementing the relationship, or is it also about potentially boosting their military might when, I mean, traditionally, of course, such sales have gone to Israel?
It was a big decision. So the F-35, I think there's going to be about 48 of them, is the most advanced fifth-generation fighter in the world. And until today, the only country in the Middle East that could purchase that was Israel. There had to be some discussions with Israel. There is a law in the United States called the quantitative military edge for Israel that other countries can't essentially gain parity with them without their approval. So there must have been some back and forth and quid pro quo with this. I imagine that's where the Abraham Accords decision or a discussion came in, and that was clearly already worked out before this meeting. It will be a big issue. There's to be some pushback in the U.S. Senate. This technology is super advanced, and they'll be concerned that it could potentially get to some of our adversaries. Not that Saudi would do that deliberately, but the more that it's out there, the more likely that could happen. But I think ultimately it will go through, and this will be a substantial increase in security cooperation between Saudi Arabia and the United States, and it'll likely push other countries like Russia and China out of Saudi Arabia. That might also have been part of this overall agreement.
Mick Mulroy, former US Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Great to have your insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. Good to be with you.